And good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Professor Messer nmap What You Need to Know webinar. My name is James Messer, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. We're going to go through quite a bit dealing with nmap. Some of you have already seen some things in your email that I've sent to you regarding some of the things we're going to go through tonight. But I put together a quick slide right at the beginning here so you get a feel for what you're really hopefully going to be able to take away from our webinar today. And what I did was go through all of the questions that you sent in, and you sent in quite a few, but I picked out the ones we got the most information on, and I've tried to put them into a format here that we could really talk about over the next 60 minutes. So one of them is how to take advantage of the newest nmap features. A number of you are familiar with nmap, but there were a group of people that haven't looked at it in a while. So you wanted to know what's going to be the newest things? What should I use to take advantage of the latest that nmap has to offer? Another frequently asked question dealt with how nmap integrates with a SQL-based database, or can it integrate with a SQL-based database? And yes, it can. There are some third-party tools I'm going to step through and give you a feel for how nmap can integrate, not just integrate with the database, but be able to make queries into the database so that if something changes on your network or you need to find out if a certain type of environment exists on your network, you can just go to the database that's already been created for you. Great capability. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about an interesting story last week with Cisco's IDS devices and how you might be able to be better prepared for problems that might occur similar to the ones that were found with this particular vulnerability. Also last week was a very interesting one dealing with Solaris, and there was a telnet vulnerability, one that was very, very, very basic, almost surprising. It turned out to be a very old vulnerability that cropped up again, and I'm going to show you how you can find those vulnerable systems and those unwanted services just using nmap. Nothing extra there. And finally, we'll talk about how you might be able to build a graphical map of your devices from nmap's XML output. And there's going to be so much more to this webinar than just what I fit onto this particular slide. This is just a sampling of some of the things that I hope you'll be able to take away from our webinar today and be able to use in your environment as well. So, our agenda. Let's step through what we're going to talk about today. I have a few announcements available so you can get a feel for what we're going to talk about. We're also going to look at, provide you with an overview of nmap. I've got also the what's new, so you can see what are those new features in nmap. What are the things you should try to see. And we also have a real-world perspective. I mentioned that Cisco IDS and Solaris. We're going to step through a few third-party tools, and I'll also take some Q&A. You've already been typing into the Q&A boxes online there, so I can see what's going on. And we're going to take a few of those and see how many we can get through in the time that we have allotted tonight. Before we get started, let's talk about a little bit of housekeeping that I have. First, everybody is muted. Even if you talk, we can't hear you. There's nothing we can do in that particular case. The way that we'll communicate tonight is over that web interface. So if you're on the phone, you can say what you'd like, but I'm not going to be able to hear any of it. You have to be able to type those questions in at this interface. And one of the nice parts about that is we'll be able to take quite a few questions that way. Now, if you are having a problem on the online side or you need help on the telephone, there's really only one command on the phone you can use, which is mute and unmute, which is the number 6. But since nobody can hear you anyway, it's not really a point to use it. But I did create a page for you. So if you're trying to understand more about what you're seeing on the website, you can go to that /webinar link at professormesser.com. I'm going to go through a lot of slides tonight. There's going to be a lot of web links out here. And what I've done is take every single web link and I put it into a single page. So if you go out to professormesser.com/resources, you'll be able to see all of the different links for every single slide that I have in my presentation that has some of those web links out there. So that's a single place you can go. Of course, afterwards, you're going to get this presentation. You're going to get a video of it. You're going to get audio. Some folks have already sent me some questions tonight. What format is the video going to be in? And I'll certainly have it in a Flash format. They requested something like a DivX, perhaps even a WMV. And what I'll do is just make a number of different formats available so that everybody will have an opportunity to go through it. I'll have an MP3 available, maybe an OGG file. I'll have a transcript built as well, which is nice. Sometimes you just like to read through and have things instantly available in a form like that. And of course, these slides will be available to you. So if you registered, if you know somebody who registered and didn't make it on tonight, that's okay. They'll still have access to all of this information. Now, one nice thing also is we've just released a new product called Nmap Secrets, and I thought it would be nice if we just gave one away. It's not only are you coming for the education, but you might get something a little extra going out the door as well. The Nmap Secrets training course is one that we've built, and we're going to give it away to just somebody randomly on the website. Unfortunately, I don't have a way to see who's dialed in, so the best way to go about doing this is we're going to pick someone at random who's over on the web login. Now, you have to be in here. When I get to the point where we're ready to pick that person, you got to be available. I have to be able to see you in the list of attendees, which is automatic on my side. I can see everybody who's listed here, and I'll choose from that list. And if you'd like some more after this, we have an Nmap Secrets mini course out there that every week, I'm going to be sending you a little tip, a little trick, a little something related to Nmap, just to keep you up to date on what some of the latest features are, maybe something that you didn't know about regarding some of the capabilities of Nmap. And I travel a lot of different places and scan a lot of different networks, and so I've started documenting some of those things. So we have some interesting stories that are coming in there as well. And you can find that link at the bottom of the page at nmapsecrets.com. This is what the Nmap Secrets looks like. It's an on-demand training that we have. A lot of you have already sent me questions about that. We have a number of people already taking advantage. That's brand new. We released it yesterday, and we're glad to do that. This is the sponsor for our webinar tonight. One last piece of announcement, Fyodor and I will be teaching a class. So if the webinar is okay, but you'd rather be in person and spend an entire day learning about how to use Nmap to protect your network, this is exactly what we're going to be doing. So at CanSec West, this is in Vancouver in April, we're teaching an all-day class. We have 2 days. Each day is the same course. So there's only 10 seats in each class. So if you'd like to attend this, and if you've ever had the chance to sit with Fyodor and learn from somebody who's really spent, that's his product. He really knows Nmap inside and out, and he's also giving away one of his books that he hasn't even released yet. So this is a good opportunity to get a tome of information, get as much information out of his brain. I'll be there also helping him and discussing. We're splitting up the course and doing a back and forth. We got some interesting tasks that people are going to go through as well. Some interesting lab sessions that we're setting up. And you can see the prices are going up. So the way that this is set up, you can start at the price today, but they go up as time goes on. So I just wanted to make everybody aware of that. So let's start with some topics here, some meaty topics here that we can get into. And with Nmap, before we even start this, I'm very interested in knowing how well you happen to know Nmap. And that's going to help me as we go through this presentation today. So up on your screen, you now see that there is a poll. And what I'd like you to do is just click on there. How well do you know Nmap? And I'm going to let you finish with that. We've got a few people still voting out there. And as we go through our presentation tonight, I'll tailor this for the most of us, but I occasionally get off on these propeller head tangents. So if I go too far out of scope, don't worry. I'll come back to the rest of you as well. Now, what's interesting about this number already is I'm going to close the poll so we can see what these numbers are like. The results are very interesting. So 20% of you on the phone don't know Nmap at all, something very new to you. And this is a very common situation I'm finding because being in this educational role with Professor Messer, I have a lot of students also getting in touch with me and asking me questions about it. So if you're new to Nmap, welcome aboard. We're glad to have you here. And certainly tonight we're going to immerse you in some of the interesting things dealing with Nmap. And it looks like most of you really know key features about Nmap. So we're going to go through and really focus on your 28%. And I'll make sure those other 46% down there are also getting something out of the night as well. I think we got a little something here for everyone. So what is Nmap? Maybe that's the best place to start. I just have a couple introductory slides before we really get into the details of Nmap. But for those of you that have never used Nmap before, this is a product created by Fyodor. And Fyodor has a website, insecure.org, where Nmap is. And he always mentions to me in my training, make sure you tell people it's free. Nmap is free. You don't have to pay anything for Nmap. It is undoubtedly one of the most popular security tools available on the internet. There are thousands of downloads of Nmap every day just from insecure.org. And for good reason. There are many, many different scanning techniques that Nmap can use to identify devices, identify services, find out what's happening on your network. And there's many different ping types in there. But probably one of the most powerful points about nmap is that it's open source. And there is just constant development going on. If you're on one of the nmap-dev mailing list, you can see there are constant communications going back and forth about nmap. And Fyodor's really created a very nice community of very smart people to help protect your network. Now, before we get into the details, I will give you a warning, because nmap, because it puts packets onto your network, it starts querying information from different devices. It can sometimes be an unintentional denial of service tool, and I'm saying this because I have caused denial of service. I have a lab here, and I'm constantly doing scans in my lab, and I break stuff all the time. I have applications go belly up on my systems a lot, but I'm trying to break them in most cases. Sometimes I'm not, but it's important that you realize that if you're using nmap on your production network during production hours, you want to be very, very careful about what you're doing. You do not want to create any problems with that. Now, the default settings themselves are rarely going to cause any problems. You can feel pretty safe with those these days, because some of the older equipment perhaps couldn't handle nmap, even its default scan, very well. There was a recent article on the nmap mailing list, the dev mailing list, talking about some older firewalls and having a problem. So I'm saying that these days, but even these days, there are legacy equipment out there in the world, and you have to be very careful about using nmap in an occasion where you have not used it before. So be very careful with what you're doing. And I'm going to show you tonight how I use nmap in my lab to watch what's going on, because I think understanding what's happening behind the scenes across the network is going to give you a better understanding of what's good and what's bad and how you can use nmap in the best possible cases. Now, if you've never used nmap before, 20% of you, then you know, and some of you, if you run nmap with the default settings, there's a lot more to nmap than just the default settings. I received a question when we set up this webinar. Some folks were asking, there's a rumor, as I understand it, we only know about half of the available capabilities. Half of the functions are even documented within nmap. Is that true? And it's a great story, but it is not true. Fyodor has done an amazing job on his website at insecure.org of documenting everything he possibly could about nmap. And what we did, I wrote a book about nmap. So many of you on the call are my book owners. Thank you very much. You purchased that book when I put it out about a year ago, just over a year ago, called Secrets of Network Cartography, a comprehensive guide to nmap. And you also got this quick reference guide. Those of you that also just purchased the training course got the quick reference guide too. Look at all this stuff. Look at all of these technologies, all these capabilities that are built into nmap. There's a reason that this particular product is so powerful, and you're looking at just one of those reasons right there. So let's talk about what's new in nmap. What have we seen come around lately? And what I did was go back about 6 months or so, somewhere in there, and I pulled out everything. I looked through the entire changelog, and if you go back and look at the changelog, it is enormous. I just picked out 4 specific things, and let's step through a few of them. I'm going to show you what some of these things are. The first one we're going to talk about is a function called iflist. If you run nmap --iflist, that's all you have to do. It's going to list the interfaces available on your device, on your nmap station. And this works whether you're in Linux, it works whether you're in Unix, it works whether you're in Windows. And that's very different. For those of you that go back with nmap, the Windows version used to have a lot of different Windows-specific commands. And if you've run nmap lately, you may have noticed they're gone. They're just missing. They're no longer part of the program. All of that functionality has been encapsulated into the source code overall. And what I'd like to do, I've got a screenshot of this, but I thought it would be useful if I was to actually pull it up here and show it to you. So now we're looking at my desktop. For those of you that can now see this on your screens, you see that I'm running a VMware Workstation on my system. I'm running a Windows desktop in this particular case, and a lot of my work I do in my sandbox. So you'll also see I'm logged in as root. Don't do this at home, kids. You don't want to run as root all the time on your production products, but in my sandbox it makes it a little bit easier for me. So on my server, if I run nmap, if I can type nmap with the iflist command, you'll see it brings up a list of what these particular devices are. I have a loopback, I have an ETH0, and I've got some other gateways listed here at the bottom. The routes are listed there. Now, why is that important? Don't we know what interfaces are on our systems? Well, sometimes we do, and if you're in the case of Windows, that may not always be the case. I'm going to, in fact, go to my Windows desktop. I'll pull up a Windows here, and let's do the same thing, nmap with a if list. And a lot just went by. I think that's why I went back and gave you that screenshot. This is my interface list on my machine. Because I'm running VMware, I've got a lot of different interfaces. And what you're going to find is when you start doing more of the advanced functions with nmap, being able to send spoofs of IP addresses, nmap may not necessarily know what the route, the correct route will be for that particular spoofed packet. So by listing out the interfaces, you can tell nmap, as one of the other command line functions, to go out a particular port. So you can force nmap to use a particular interface when it's sending its traffic. And having this integrated in Windows, in Linux, and in everything else, that's just a great capability that was a long time coming, especially for Windows users. And although we talk about nmap as being an open source tool, it's often considered a Linux tool, and in many cases, one of the things we talk about in our book and in our course is that the features probably they come out more often, and they are first in a Linux environment in many cases. Windows is just a little bit more of a challenge in sometimes to work around some of the operating system problems, and oftentimes we don't have this capability. Now we do. So this is a great addition for you Windows users to keep in your back pocket. Another capability is one called Spoof Mac. Now, for those of you that I was just communicating to you about the spoofing. There's a spoofing of IP addresses you've been able to do in nmap for quite some time. Well, now you can also spoof MAC addresses. And when we start spoofing MAC addresses, it's really almost the same thing as what we were doing before with our IP addresses. What I'd like to do is give you a feel for what it looks like when you spoof a MAC address. So I'm going to go back to my sandbox here. Pardon my clicking there. And it's really easy. Here's the way you do it. I'm just going to run it with the default nmap command, and I'm going to run it to my local host because we're not doing anything special here. But I'm going to spoof my MAC address, and I'm just going to say 0. And that's one of the options you can use. When you choose 0, what it does is it gives you a random MAC address. You can see there's no vendor that's associated with this MAC address. And that's interesting in itself. Let's say we wanted to pretend we were something else though. So we want to pretend we're a Cisco device. So anybody out there happen to know what the first 3 bytes are of a Cisco? Yeah, I don't know either. But fortunately we can just type Cisco. And it will look up Cisco's address, their first 3 bytes of its address, and put it in here. It even tells you, yep, you're a Cisco Systems device, and it randomly assigned those 3 bytes at the end. So that was nice to see as well. Now, if you wanted to go through and put in every single byte of the MAC address, you could do that as well. So you have complete control over what you spoof there. Now, spoofing a MAC address is useful. It's what we call a ninja scanning technique, which means you kind of hide in the shadows. You're like the wind. Nobody knows that you're there. And so it's a very useful technique on a production environment when you're trying to still keep the network secure, but the last thing you want to do on a production environment is disrupt the normal operations. So these ninja scanning techniques can be very, very useful. This is a frequently asked question of us, so much that in our course we created an entire module that was just for ninja scanning because we got so many questions about it. So if you want to hide on the local subnet, it's a great capability, but it doesn't do much else because once your packets hit a router, those of you that know, the router is going to use its own MAC address on the next segment over. But oftentimes when people start tracking things back, and these days it's becoming easier and easier to gather large amounts of packets and store them for a longer amount of time. Many of you are familiar with stream-to-disk technology. So some of that now also gives you a chance to maybe hide a little bit on the local subnet or pretend that you're someone else. Sometimes that's fun too, isn't it? So now I'm going to tell you about my newest favorite feature of nmap, the runtime interaction. Okay, just saying that puts me in a sort of a geek place all unto itself, doesn't it? All right, well let's go back to our front end here. We're at our VMware station. Here we go, and I'm going to run a scan, and let's do it, and I'll show you the runtime interaction. Let's just run a default nmap scan to scanme.insecure.org. Now, for those of you familiar with ScanMe, that's a device that Fyodor uses a lot of times for the demonstrations that he uses. I thought it would be a good choice to use here. And I'm just going to use the default. So I'm not even going to turn on verbosity, which is what I will normally do when I'm scanning. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Let's just hit enter and see what happens. So I'm using my internet connection, so hopefully our webinar stays up. Now, normally this is what happens. nmap just sits there and waits for this scan to complete. What you can do now are hit things like the question mark, and that gives you a list of things that you can do. If I hit any key other than V, D, or P, I love this. It tells you that it's currently doing send stealth scan timing. It's about 38% done, and it's got about 23 seconds till it's finished. That is fabulous. Now, if you've ever been in a long scan and you're wondering what's going on, when is this going to finish, now we've got a pretty good idea of really what's going on behind the scenes. You just keep hitting any key and it's going to update itself as things change with the way the packets are going across the network. If you'd like to increase verbosity, you can hit the V key. A capital V decreases. A packet trace, let's turn on P. Woo. There's a lot of packets going by. I'm going to turn packet tracing off. If you're a developer, you can even turn on debugging so you can see what's happening there. And I'm going to turn my debugging off. But you get the idea. This is a nice capability that gives you these instant updates of what's going on with nmap. It is indeed one that a feature, if you're like an ADD person like me, you're constantly want to know when it's going to be done. Okay, how about now? Okay, how about now? And you just sit here and wait for it to finish. Sometimes that can be useful too. It's the little things, isn't it? So the runtime interaction, very, very useful. I love it. And if you want more help on it, there's an entire man page that Fyodor set up on runtime interaction. His site is fabulous for going in and looking at the documentation of nmap and seeing what's going on. So that's a great place to go. Now, the last new feature of nmap I'm going to tell you about is also an old feature of nmap in a way. It's the OS fingerprinting engine. The OS fingerprinting engine is something that's been in nmap for an awfully long time, but even since the old days of nmap, OS fingerprinting perhaps wasn't used as much as many people should. Well, what Fyodor has done has created a new engine for OS fingerprinting that's even more precise. It has a lot more capabilities. What's nice about this is it's relatively new. It's a number of months old, and the database itself still needs submissions. Let's talk about OS fingerprinting for a moment. Let me give you a feel for what this really does. The interesting part of what nmap does in many cases is it's able to determine a lot of information from a remote device without ever logging into the device, without ever authenticating to the device. All that nmap does is send a certain kind of frame, a TCP frame, a UDP packet, an ICMP frame, and look at the response that it gets back. Different operating systems have different nuances in the responses that they send back to the source. And by exploiting the differences that we receive from these different devices, we can determine what operating system most of the time is running on that device. It's extremely accurate. Now, that OS fingerprinting engine, we're going to talk more about it when we go through some real-world tests here in just a moment. But what I like about the fingerprinting engine is that it provides me with a lot of details. We call these recon scans in our course because we get a lot of reconnaissance about what's out there on the network. Now, because this is a new technology, a new fingerprinting for the OS detection, we need to fill up the database. We need to find out all of these different operating systems out there. We had the luxury with the old OS fingerprinting method that we were able to find a lot of different types of systems out there. We just had a lot of different fingerprints to choose from. Now we're not as flexible as we used to be. So if you have in your environment a legacy device and you know what operating system's running on it, run an nmap scan with that -O2 option, not 02, but O as an operating system number 2, and it will perform an operating system scan, and it will tell you if it recognizes it or not. And if it doesn't, it says go visit the nmap submission page and put it out there. And you can really this goes a long way, and this really helps everybody because those signatures get integrated right into nmap. A lot of great capabilities there. So there's my 4 newest features of nmap. Hopefully that's giving you a feel for some of the things you can go back and use nmap for right now. I'd really like to know something else. Let's open up another poll here. I'm very interested in knowing how often you use nmap. And since 20% of you have not used nmap before, then it'll probably be the case that 20% of you have never used it. So we already know what some of these numbers are that we're going to get back. What we're going to do is step through some real world examples of using nmap, and we're going to use some technology. So it's interesting to me to see exactly how you use it, when you use it, and those types of things. This will be a very interesting poll to look at. The numbers aren't quite syncing up the way I thought they would be. Let me give you another couple seconds on this one. And what we're going to look at is see who's the hardcore users. Do you use it every day? Do you never use it? And we're going to see what we got. We're going to close this poll. I'll show you the results here real quick. And here are the interesting numbers. Although 20% of you never used nmap, well, 10% of you never used it here. So, well, close enough. This is hardly scientific. Now, for those of you on the call, it looks like the bulk of us are right in the middle. We've used it once or twice, or maybe we use it once or twice a week to get a feel for what's really going on out there on our network. And 9 to 10% of you out there every day live and die by it. And I'm with you. I understand. Once you start really getting into nmap and understanding what it's doing, you really can get a lot of information. This entire course, all the books that I wrote about nmap, really came from me sitting down. I thought I'd write a 2-page, 5-page article on how to use nmap. And then I started getting into it. And I started learning more about what it was doing and realizing this got some legs. This has some scope. So, we're going to find out what's really going on with this particular, nmap. And we're going to see what we can do with nmap in a real world environment. So let's step through, speaking of real world, let's step through and see what Cisco IDS fragmentation vulnerability happened to be, because this was very interesting in the news last week. It was a little blip. It wasn't as big as some of the other vulnerabilities that came out, but I thought since it was timely, it would be an interesting one to go through. Now, for those of you that joined us late, all of the web links that are in this presentation tonight are out on professormesser.com/resources. So you can go now and see every single link that we have in here. That's professormesser.com/resources. So, on the 13th, day before Valentine's Day, we see that Cisco announced there was a bit of a vulnerability relating to its IDS products. And the quote from the Cisco, was, "The fragmented IP packets may be used to evade signature inspection." Now, for those of you that have been around in the security business for a while, you know this is not an unusual thing. Fragmented packets seem to be the bane of these developers, because it's really something you don't see much in the real world, but because it's part of the specification of IP, it's something that could happen. And that becomes a bit of a challenge for developers when they are creating these IDS products and trying to understand what's going on. It used to be a lot of firewalls. You could go right through them if you fragmented your IP packets. And almost all the products out there have gotten smart, but every once in a while, you get these kind of vulnerabilities that come through. Well, what is this? What is IP fragmentation? Let's step back a moment. Let me show you what really happens when you look at fragmentation of an IP frame. This is something I grabbed from my book. It really illustrates it nicely, and because I'm a visual person, I need lots of color. So this helps me a lot when I start to explain it. The DLC header here, IP header, that's what we're used to seeing at the beginning of the frames. When we talk about fragmenting, it's everything past the IP header. So this is IP fragmentation. That's why I specified up here IP fragmentation. And you can see the TCP header in this particular frame that I set up, I made about 20 bytes. The TCP data in that frame, I made 24 bytes. And that's pretty usual for the types of frames that you'll see nmap do. And we'll perhaps look at some in just a moment. Now, when we start fragmenting, if we turn fragmentation on with nmap, here's what you find. That one frame that was going across the network now turns into 3. Because we fragmented everything past the IP header. The first fragment, I got 16 byte fragment frames here. I got 16 bytes here, and then another 16 bytes here in the second frame. But notice that we still have a little bit left of the TCP header, and then we go right into the TCP data. And the last frame has the last bit of fragment on the end of it. Now, that's absolutely normal. It's exactly the way we would expect IP fragmentation to work, but you can see now why, on occasion, it can drive your IDSs and other devices just crazy, because this might throw something at them. I mean, look, after this IP header, you're getting the tail end of a TCP header. That makes no sense to products unless they're smart enough to understand that there's a fragmentation bit set right here and where the offsets happen to be. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a moment. The fragments, you're going to find they're always in multiples of 8. There are only a certain amount of space in the IP header to specify where the offsets are. So the offsets are set up in 8-byte fragments. Now, if you're going to test fragmentation, I've made this, you can tell my skills for doing these graphics are just amazing, aren't they? So all you green people out here, I'm not picking on you. Some of my favorite people are green. I got friends that are green. So here's you, the smart nmap user out there. We got a firewall in the middle. Maybe it's one made by a company that had a vulnerability last week. And then we've got the server that we want to look at. So if you want to see what the results will be, you're probably going to want some type of packet analysis tool on the back side of this router. You'd like to see everything that's going into and out of that server when you perform your scans. And when you perform your scans, all you have to do to turn on fragmentation is put a -F, and that will fragment to 8-byte parameters there. If you put a -FF, it's a 16-byte fragmentation. And that's all you have to do. That's the default scan. I would put a verbosity in there. There's probably other things I can do during that scan. But if all you're looking to do is test fragmentation, that's exactly what's going to happen. So let's try this. Let me show you what you get if you were to put a packet analysis tool on the other side. I'm going to flip back over here to my VMware station. Let's have a look at this. And what I've got on the other side, I haven't done this while working on the webinar as well. We're going to see a lot of packets go back and forth over this particular network, but we'll just filter once we're done. I'm just going to start a capture. For those of you who've never seen this before, this is Wireshark. It used to be called Ethereal, so it now has a different name, but it's the same product. It's the same people working on it. The Wireshark analyzer is one that just captures all the packets going across my network, and I've got it in here. I'm going to turn a few things off because we don't need packets to update in real time, and I'd actually kind of like to see the capture dialog box as we go along here. And let's start this out. I don't want my transport name resolution turned on either. I'd like to see the raw port numbers when they're going. Instead of seeing HTTP, it's going to show me the raw port number of 80, and that's going to be useful for us when we start looking at this. So let's start capturing packets, and you can see, sure enough, I'm on a webinar, and we'll just see constant TCP packets going across. Just ignore that for now. We're gonna filter that out after the fact. So let's perform one of those nmap scans. I'm going to nmap to a 192.168.67 address that I happen to have here in my local lab. I hope it's still up and running over there in the other room. And we'll do a -F. And we'll start a scan. I'm not going to use any other parameters than that. And we'll just let it go across the network. And there, it's done. We finished our scan and we found a couple of different things. And let's stop our trace file. Now, if you've ever done a Wireshark capture, it's going to go through and pull those packets in. We got quite a bit that I captured here. There we go. There's our packets. Now, we're also going to want a set of filter here. I did everything to .67. So let's set our filter to .67 and apply that off. That's going to change what we see on our screen here. I think it's going to help us. So my device is called Quinn, and I was scanning a device called Shepherd. So we see this listed here in this particular piece. Now, if you're using Wireshark off the shelf, you may notice that my decode looks a little bit different than yours. What I've done is go into the parameters of Wireshark under Edit Preferences. There we go. And what I did was change the capture behavior so that, there we go. Here we go. We've got capturing in my views. Here we go. So I've got a view of my protocol IP. Scroll down a little bit. What I wanted to do with IP is not put it back together. Wireshark's very nice for you. It will go ahead and put together frames so that they make sense to us human beings. But I wanted to actually see the fragmented frames. I did not want Wireshark to reassemble them. So I turned mine off. And if that's under Edit, your preferences, I went all the way down to Protocols under IP and turned off the reassembly. So that's why mine might look a little bit different than yours. So one other thing you'll notice too is you're seeing different colors. I've changed the colors. I created a customized coloring scheme for Wireshark that is specific to nmap. So every time you receive a port that's closed, it will mark it as red. If there's a port that's open, it will mark it as green. If it's a port that is being tested, it'll be yellow. Now, I didn't do it for fragmented frames because that gets into a little bit more of a challenge. It's also not something you would see very often, but you can easily see now when there's a yellow, when we're polling that device, when we're doing a scan of it, and if there happens to be an open port, turns green. This is a special bonus you get if you're someone who has purchased our training program. That just comes with it for free. I just threw that in. Now you can see when it starts this fragmentation, it's very interesting that we start to see some of these things come through. So let's start a fragmented frame. Here's the first part of this TCP fragmented frame. And without going into more of the details, you can see that sure enough, there's a flag right there in the IP header that says there are more fragments coming. And we even goes through and putting through the reassembled frame. If we go all the way down to the last fragment, we can see that's it. We're done with the fragments. There's no more fragments here to deal with, and we got to the end of that piece. So this decode view that we have of the fragmented frames, we can sure enough see that all those frames are coming through. If we were on the other side of our firewall and we were hoping that these frames were not coming through, we were perhaps now seeing that we're seeing fragmented frames come through that firewall. Maybe it's not working the way we would have thought. So now that I've put that into your head, that'll give you something to do at work tomorrow so you can see exactly what's going on with your fragmented devices. Let's now shift gears a little bit and talk about that other vulnerability that happened last week. This one was a little bit more in the news. When things start popping up on Slashdot, I know that that's a vulnerability that everybody's got their eye on. And part of the problem with this particular Solaris vulnerability is that it was just so darn easy. You just telnet to a Solaris device and you own the box, your root. Ta-da, it was that hard. It was a little bit more than that. There were a few extra parameters you put on the end of telnet, but it's not like you had to go get Metasploit or you had to find a particular buffer overflow for a particular service. It just did it to telnet, and that was way, way too easy. And so immediately, Sun said you need to turn telnet off. They also put out a little patch, a little notification on how you could turn logging in as root with telnet or run telnet with something other than root, and maybe just log on that way at the console rather than across the network. So there's a few extra options that have shown up since then. But again, I put that cert vulnerability in there. Again, that's in the Professor Messer /resources page, and you can see what all the hubbub was about. Now, of course, running telnet. How many people running telnet on their network? Well, do you know? You'd think maybe we aren't at this point. Maybe we've gotten past that. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting, how would we go about trying to determine if telnet was running in our environment? And after we knew that, can we tell if it's running Solaris? So one of the things that I did was go out to the new nmap operating system database. This used to be called nmap OS fingerprints. Now it's called nmap OSDB. That's the new second generation operating system fingerprinting. And I grepped, I did not grep Solaris. I grepped Olaris because I wasn't sure whether the S would be capitalized or not. So that's why it's me not misspelling in this particular case. That actually is what I intended to do. And you can see it found quite a few. Yes, we do have fingerprints in the new database for Sun Solaris 9, Sun Solaris 10. So we should be able to do an operating system scan on our network and feel pretty good that we can find a Solaris box. That's all I wanted to do with this particular slide. So our strategy is going to be to find a telnet maybe out there. So it's going to be TCP port 23, right? I'm going to want to do an operating system scan. And if you wanted to specify the second gen, you could always put a 2 at the end of that O. Now, why stop there, really? There are other bad ports on your network. There is FTP that might be open somewhere. If there are other ports that you want to be sure are not open on your network, that's almost just as important to scan for those as anything else. You don't want these bad or unwanted ports on your network. Now, because you see a port 23 pop up, doesn't necessarily mean that it's telnet, though. Now, does it? Because the craftier of you out there, and you know who you are going to get into your devices and run a web server on port 23. Or you're going to do something like an IRC server on port 23. You're going to be sneaky. Or something that's, a Quake server on port 23. What you can also do is turn on version detection. This is something we haven't talked about yet. This is very useful as a real-world tool. The version detection allows us to get more reconnaissance from these devices. It is a recon scan, as we categorize it here at Professor Messer, because it goes out and gathers a lot of information about the specific version of a service that is running on a port. It's a little bit more intrusive than an operating system scan is because it's actually getting to a login page. It's looking at what the banners might be. It goes down a particular path. It doesn't log in. It doesn't authenticate, but it certainly does open up a session. You're going to be in a log somewhere that a session was opened if you use this particular function. So let's see what that's like. So if we were going to run that on our network, let's start at the beginning of this. I'm going to make this full screen again so we can see everything that's going on. There we go. And let's run an operating system scan just out there. Let's say I want to see if telnet's running anywhere in my environment. So I'm going to run nmap. Let's run it to my environment here. dot anything, 192.168.0 dot anything that happens to be out there. I don't have that many devices here. I'm on my home office network, so there's all kinds of interesting things we're going to find in my particular home. I'm going to find out also, I just want to know maybe if port 23 is open. Let's also do port 21. So we're going to look for telnet, and we're going to look for FTP. That's all we're going to look for on my network. And we do that by specifying -P. And normally when you do an nmap scan, thousands of ports are scanned. By running it this way, 2 ports are scanned. Very, very fast. If you're looking for a particular port, this is a very quick way to do it. You don't have to scan every single port. We can be very focused with this. That's it. I'm not going to run anything else with this particular scan, just for demonstration purposes. And we hit enter. Boom. We're already getting information back. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is that we've already seen some that are open. We have on that .67, looks like it's scrolling up the page. Okay, we're finished. I'm going to go back up a little bit more so we can see what's going on there. Here we go. So on my .67 device that's out there, FTP, Telnet, RPC, we got a lot going on those devices. Here we go. O'Neill is closed on port 2123. Jackson is filtered, so it's got a filter. We didn't get a response back from those particular devices. Quinn, that's me, they're closed. On the Mitchell device, they're filtered. .8 open. So that .8 device out there on my network has both FTP and Telnet open. .9 out there does not. It's filtered, so there must be a firewall, or I'm not getting to that device. I was able to ping it, but it did not respond to me. And the .67, we scanned this one earlier, FTP and Telnet is open. So just by doing that, I was able to see what on my network happens to be open and available, and I'm really interested in knowing more about that .67. So let's focus our effort a little bit. Let's go to that .67, and I want to run a version scan. I want to see what is port 2123. We think it's FTP and we think it's Telnet, but is it really? Let's find out. And the reason I didn't specify particular ports here is because I was already hitting enter. I could have just specified a -P, and we could have gotten a port 21 and 23 out of that as well. But we're just going to let it run and see what it comes back with here. Now, this .67 is a mystery device. I wasn't expecting to see that on my network, and in reality, it's one I put out there just for doing these particular tests. This is a good example of when you'd find something popping up that you just weren't expecting to see. You didn't expect to see both FTP and Telnet available on these devices running over your network. And since I'm getting a little impatient at this point, I'm going to hit enter. Oh, I know what, this is also something that happened in the rehearsal too, is it sits here. A version scan on this one takes a long time. I thought I was going to use a different device that was taking so long, but then I thought it would be good to show you this, that sometimes a version scan isn't just a couple of frames going back and forth. This can be relatively involved because nmap will go down a path of trying to really determine what services are running on that device. And if it doesn't get a hit, it starts going through a lot of different services. Now, there are ways that you can go into a version scan and customize how intense it's going to be about looking at different versions of things. In this case, I just wanted to use the default. I wanted to go through every possible scenario with this version scan, and that's exactly what's going on behind the scenes. It's not a lot of traffic. I'm going to turn on the packet tracing so that you've got a feel for exactly what's going across this network. And let's see if you can see I've got it turned on. It's just sitting there. So nmap is sending a couple things across, and it's waiting to see what happens. And it sends a couple more, and it waits to see what happens. And that's one of the nice things about version scan. It's very smart about what it does and how it works. As I mentioned earlier, there are an amazing number of functions and utilities within nmap. And when you start getting into the details of nmap, you're going to be really surprised at how smart it is about what it's doing. Wow, well, look at all this that suddenly popped up. Let's rewind this screen a little bit and see what we got here. I'd like to see just what is happening on this particular link and get a feel for what's going on. I think in this particular case, I want to know more about what's happening on this particular version of this device. And as we go through it and look at what's happening on this device, there we go. And got a mouse around here somewhere. Get to this keyboard. And we were all doing pretty good up to that point, weren't we? There we go. And if we go back and look at all of these things that were running across that particular scan, there's a lot that suddenly happened on this screen. So let's go back in and let's scroll up a little bit into this view and see what's on here. as this poor machine catches up to what we were doing with our keyboard and our mouse here. There we go. So what was all of this that popped up on our screen? Let's move up a little bit. It went to .67 and it looked at the FTP and telnet. Don't know. Question mark. Did not know what was there. Now it found that service and a lot of data came back to that and even said, look, we found something new. Go out to the submission site and put this in there if you happen to know what this is. And a lot suddenly showed up on this screen. So what is this device? Well, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to give you more information on this device quite yet because this is going to lead us into that April training. Now, this device is one that I'm going to bring with me to Vancouver, and we're going to do more tests with this device. And after that, maybe we'll do another webinar, and I'll take you through what we found in Vancouver. I think that would be very interesting to see what was going on in that case. So I'm going to leave you hanging a little bit. Don't hate me for that, but trust me, it'll be good on the next webinar. We'll go through those pieces. Okay, the moment you've been waiting for. Let's give something away. I know we're not at the end of the presentation. I've got a lot more to go through, but I thought let's not keep you all the way to the end. If you really like to get that training course, I think we should give it away to somebody. I think we should see what's going on out there. So we are going to go into our hat here, and we're going to pull out a list of the attendees that are on the call right now. Oh, there's quite a few out here. And we're going to go through this list, and I'm going to call your name. You don't have to, obviously I can't hear you respond, but I'm going to call your name out here, and we're going to find out exactly what's, I've got your email address and this other information. I'll make sure I get in touch with you. Don't worry, it's not going to be a situation where we run into a problem here. So, looking through our list, we'll pull out the name of Randy Kohler. So Randy, I have your email address. Congratulations. I'm going to make sure that you get that license of nmap secrets tonight and are able to take advantage of that immediately. So that's congratulations to you. And for those of you interested, you can always go out to nmapsecrets.com and have a look at some of the things we have there. All right, let's go to the next section of what we have in our presentation tonight. By the way, the nmap secrets training course, for those of you that have not seen this out there, there's a lot to it. I've got screencasts and trace files and the coloring scheme and the quick reference guide and the hours of training that's out there. Feel free to have a look at what we've got going on in those particular views. And what's also nice about it is Professor Judy Messer is the one that provided the training, so that's also not a bad thing either. So let's step through other things. I told you tonight we were going to integrate nmap with SQL-based databases, and we were going to go through and see how nmap related to some other things on your network, how we were able to graphically view network maps. Well, we do that with third-party software, with things that are not nmap related. Let's go see the relation to nmap here is very solid though. So as we step through this, I've got another poll for you because as we step through these third-party programs, I'd love to know if some of you out there use these third-party programs, and we're going to talk a lot about them. I've got some demonstrations of those to show you tonight. So I'm going to open up this poll. So these are the third-party programs we're going to talk about tonight. UMIT. This should say PBNJ, not PBJ with an underscore. I must have put an ampersand, and poor Windows, it thinks you mean to underline it. nCartographer and nmap FE. So if you've used those, go ahead and place your vote on those. I'm not going to describe to you exactly what they do. Some of them are relatively obvious because we're going to go through them. I've got them running right here. I'm going to give you an interactive demonstration of what these third-party tools do, except for one of them, and I'll explain about that one as well as we go through this. All right, about 62% of you have voted. I'm going to give you another couple seconds to get your vote in. And almost everybody, okay, I think we've got some pretty good numbers there. So let's close that poll up, and I'll show you the results. You can see that large number of you use nmap FE. Now, what's really interesting about this, a lot of you don't use any of them. So whether it's a case where you just use nmap, or maybe you didn't even know that these particular products existed out there, and since they're all free, this becomes useful as well. So a lot of you have used nmap FE, and that makes sense. That is something that actually ships with nmap. It's a front end. That's what the FE stands for. In Cartographer, we're going to look at a couple of you. PB&J, 0. And that to me is very interesting. You're going to love what you hear about this particular program. And so I really like this program. And so I'm starting our conversation about the utilities with PB&J. And it used to stand for something, as Joshua Abraham says, in the MP3 that is on his website at that link, pbnj.sourceforge.net. He is a fellow that has taken nmap's XML output and has used it in a SQL library, a SQL database, a Perl library called SQLite. And what's really useful about this is that it will just go out and scan your network and store the information. And if you'd like to perform a query of the database, maybe last week suddenly you found out that Solaris had a telnet vulnerability. Who would have thunk it? Well, maybe you just want to go to your database and ask via a SQL query, select for all of my devices if port 23 is open and if it's a Solaris. Click, there you go. You've got the answer. That's what this does. This is probably one of the neatest little utilities that hardly anybody knows about, and hopefully this will help get his name out. Joshua is got a great website out there. I'm going to see if we can get out to this website. I'm going to click on his website there. It was PB&J is out here. It is very intensive with Perl. You need a lot of different Perl libraries loaded, and I even tried to get a few things running on my machine to show you this tonight, but I just ran out of, between launching our new training program and answering questions from you and getting this webinar together, just wasn't able to, but that's going to be a perfect topic, I think, for our next webinar. So go out here. What's also nice on his site, he's got a presentation he did with PB&J and nmap, great PDF slides and OGG and MP3 file out there. The recording was made out in the audience, but you can still hear what he's saying and the description of the talk he gave. Really interesting stuff. He's really thinking ahead. There are things PB&J does not do yet. He's thinking in his mind that he wants to do with it. So more power to him. The way this works is two different engines, really, and I'm simplifying it a great deal. His PDF file really goes into the details. But there's a scanning engine that uses nmap, and it uses the XML output from nmap, parses it, and then stores it in the SQL database. Now, this is not MySQL. It's something that we can just run on a machine using Perl. It's very simple, but it is SQL-based. So you're able to use the output engine in PB&J to create a query of what's going on out there. It's a SQL-based query, which makes it even better, and just tell it to run the query against that database and output the file in many different kinds of formats. If you'd want a CSV file, if you want an HTML file, maybe you'd like a SQL import file that you can then put it into MySQL with. So that capability is possible. I won't say that output format has been written yet. I'm not certain it really does. This is not an easy program to use. It is very propeller headish. It's a little intensive. You need to know a little bit about SQL, so it can be a little disconcerting when you start to get into it, but it's very, very promising, and there's an amazing amount of capabilities in it today. He's done an amazing amount of work with PB&J, and I hope to do more demonstrations with this in the future. We've also got another program called nCartographer. One of the questions that came up was, I'd like to see in nmap a graph. You know, I'm already polling all of these devices. I'm probing them. I'm gathering information from them. And this project admin, his name's Stripe Dog, went in and created a very graphical front end to this called nCartographer. And I've got it running on my Windows desktop here. You'll notice tonight I'm flipping back and forth between Linux and Windows, a little different. What I'm trying to do is mix it up. And most of these programs have a Linux version or Unix type version you can compile over there as well. But I've got different people on the call using it in different operating systems, so I want to be sure I kind of cover the bases and let you know what's available out there. Well, it's very simple. You take an XML output file from nmap. If you use the dash lowercase o capital X and a file name, nmap will put everything into an XML file. And I've got one out here that I'm going to run is this output.xml. And that's it. You just click it, and it creates this neat little map of what it happened to find out there. Now, this was a very simple nmap scan that I used. If I did a version detection scan, it would have actually identified, or operating system scan, it would have identified the operating system and put a little icon for that operating system in here. If I'd run a version detection, it would have put the version of these services out there. And I think I've got a screenshot of that in my presentation to show you. Yeah, there's an example of it finding a Windows device, and actually this is on my network. So there's my Netgear router that I use here in my home office with my .1. It was able to find a lot of information just by running the nmap. I outputted everything with a -o, a -sv, and I did it for all those different devices. So that's how I ran my nCartographer and got that output. It's pretty neat. There's different levels that you can use. Maybe you'd like it to be a little bit smaller. Some something you can reference that way, and you can output it as a PNG file as well. So if you want to take that and then put it into a document you're creating, stick it out on a website somewhere, it can be useful for that too. Nice little utility. Now, one that many of you out there, that's number 2 on our list when we did our poll, was UMIT, U-M-I-T. UMIT is a product that is maintained by Adriano Monteiro Marques, who undoubtedly has the coolest name on this webinar tonight. He also goes by the name of Boltrix. For those of you that don't want to say Adriano Monteiro Marques, and I barely can, it's Boltrix. You may have heard of him. So the link out on SourceForge for UMIT, what UMIT is a graphical front end for database, for nmap. The graphical front end for nmap is very useful if you're just getting into nmap. You aren't sure what all the different selections are. It's almost a philosophical conversation when you get into the idea of this open source Linux environment. Do you use a user interface? Do you not? But don't make any decisions quite yet. Let's look at UMIT first, and then we'll decide if it's worth looking at. So I'm going to start UMIT up here. You'll be very interested to see. Now I'm running at 1024 by 768 on my screen, so we can't quite fit everything on here exactly the way I'd want. I think we're doing pretty good though. This is the UMIT front ends for nmap. Now you can see that very basic to start with. I can set a target here. In fact, let's put in our localhost. And notice the command line here moves. What profile? There are certain profiles that are set up. So if you just want to set a profile that always does a certain thing, run profile number 1, run my recon profile, run my ninja profile, run the profile that finds all my telnet running on my Solaris boxes. You can set those up. And as you change the profiles, notice it changes the commands that are listed there as well. Now you could also manually put things in there as well, but what's nice about UMIT, it has this nice command wizard, and I'm going to run the expert side of the command wizard, and you'll see why in just a moment, because this shows us we can build a profile with all of the different commands available to nmap. I can see all of the different scans. I can see even special scans that aren't normally listed. Look at all these scans that come with nmap. If you've never gotten into nmap, you may be surprised that even all these different timing options are available. Maybe you want to be sneaky, which means it only sends frames at a certain rate. The insane rate is exactly that. It really starts blasting traffic across your network. And again, remember I told you about denial of service? That's what I'm talking about right there. You want to be very careful with that. And we've got some other timing capabilities, other functions like IPv6 support. There are a few scans that support IPv6. There needs to be more. One of the questions we got before this is that what can we do with IPv6 in nmap? And we can do quite a bit, but not enough. For those of you that are not a federal government of the United States or China or some of the other governments around the world, you may be even wondering why I'm mentioning IPv6. Well, our governments around the world have a very large push to get IPv6 implemented. They have been mandated to implement it very quickly in their environments for many reasons, not just IP addresses, but having IPsec built in. There's a lot of capabilities with being able to route better because of the hierarchical routing that's built into IPv6. They're really going to take advantage of these things, and they want to do it first. So our government is leading the way. If you talk to private organizations, it doesn't often seem that way. There's a lot of different pings. When you run an nmap scan, nmap won't scan a device unless it knows it's there. And there's a default ping that occurs, but you might want to specify what the ping is or tell it what port you would like to ping on. Look at all those different options. And they're all in here. Just point and click. It's all available. This almost is a nice educational tool for nmap. If you're trying to understand more about what nmap does, go through each one of these options, start understanding what it does. That's what we did with our book, is every single nmap option we went through, we documented it, we said why it was good, why it was bad, and it turned out to be 250 pages worth once we were through with it, because there's so much here. And something interesting to look at. So go out and look at UMIT. If you haven't used it before, a lot of you use WinMap FE. I just blew your mind just then. You just went, wow, look at all that's available. Why is that? That seems unusual, isn't it? And it kind of is. I'm going to jump, in fact, to the Windows front end that I have here. We're going to talk about the nmap FE. Now, what's nice about nmap FE? It's included with nmap. It comes with it. When you compile, it's compiled in there automatically. It's not really an everyday utility, though. It's not really one that you'd run into a lot when using nmap, just because it's a little bit limited. And let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to go back to our Linux environment here to run nmap FE just because it looks a little bit nicer. And I'll show you. This is front end, so I'm going to go to nmap FE. You can see the front end, though. It's kind of similar to UMIT, but it doesn't have quite the same number of options. They aren't quite laid out exactly the same as that. Still, a lot of them are in here. And, you got to give credit to this development team for nmap that just continues to add capabilities. The front ends and graphical front ends are not something that's really stressed a lot in security. And as we're finding, security is becoming so much more important on people's environments that you need easier ways to do these. We have people coming through the ranks that want to know more about security. This is a nice place to start and understand what's going on. I just kind of think the UMIT front end is probably a little bit nicer, but one nice thing, they've kept the nmap front end commands all up to date, and that's nice too. I think at one point there was a thought of maybe moving over to UMIT as the front end for nmap, and maybe that'll happen someday. We'll see what goes on with that, but that's sort of a nice front end to use. Perhaps not every day, but it's one that is relatively useful. Okay, well, I will notice, looking at the clock, I've been talking an awful lot. I've been talking for an hour. And I did say we were going to spend time for some Q&A tonight, and we absolutely are. So I'm not going to leave you hanging any more on that. Now, I set this aside for an hour, but the GoToWebinar is a great thing. I can just keep talking all night long if I want to, and it will let me do that. And we can stay on here as long as I'd like. So if you guys want to hang out, I'm going to hang out as well. So let's go through a few of the questions that you've sent in. Oh my, we're never going to get through all of these questions tonight. Well, we're going to get through quite a few though. Let's have a look at some that are out there. One of the questions was, and I can't even believe Fyodor haunts me because I didn't mention, I showed you all these programs. I showed you the UMIT and the PB&J and all those other utilities. They're all free. Every single one of them is open source. It's free. You can go to those links tonight. You can download it and you can use them. It is very nice to have that capability, and the fact that it's free is really just a bonus. So Tim, thank you for that question. Thanks for catching me on that. And the nice thing about having this question and answer, I'm going to flip through others of these. If you have a question you would like to put in, we've got that Q&A that's on your screen. Feel free to type anything in there and see what you'd like to talk about as well. So I'm going to flip through these. Give me just a moment. Is nmap going to benefit from Google's Summer of Code again this year? And for those of you that aren't familiar, Google has a great program they do during the summer called the Summer of Code, and Fyodor has sponsored some interns or some coders or developers. I'm not sure how they're referenced during the Summer of Code, but they are generally students that come to Google to learn more about doing development work. And what Google does is go out to the different development houses out there and ask, will you sponsor some of these kids to come in and learn about these technologies, especially on the security side? And Fyodor's been great and sponsored. This is an investment of time and money to do that for these kids that are learning more about how to develop. For the past, at least the past 2 years, he's done this with the Google Summer of Code and things that you've seen tonight, like UMIT, and there is a scanning engine, a scripting engine with nmap, still in beta, but it's being worked on. Fyodor says, I get to teach that one out in Vancouver. So the nmap scanning engine, the NSE, is one that's also part of that's come from the Summer of Codes. This is a great thing. Now, is nmap going to benefit from that again this year? I sure hope so. So just by you asking it, make sure that we let Fyodor know that some of the things that have come from that Summer of Code were very, very useful and very, very helpful for what we were doing. So a lot of these questions were already answered, so I apologize if I'm not going to get to your question tonight. There are an amazing number of questions on here on this webinar. I will mention again, because a lot of people did ask again if this webinar was going to be available for download. For those of you that happen to pop in just a few minutes late, absolutely. I'm going to make the audio, I'm going to make the video, and we're going to have a transcript made of this. I'm going to try to get as much of those out there as soon as I can so that you're able to do something with those as quickly as possible. The transcript may take a few extra days, but you will get an email from me that has that in there with the links that you can go to. And if you haven't heard from me, if the big spam monster has eaten my email and you haven't heard from me, send me an email, james@professormesser.com, and I'll make sure that I go through my spam box doesn't delete anything. I happen to go through it every day or so. So I'll catch that and make sure that you get the link. Everybody who registered for this gets that link. So here's another good question about what scans are dangerous. Joshua was asking this. What scans are not appropriate for a production environment? I talked earlier about what scans are okay in a production environment, but we really didn't talk about what scans would be really, really bad for production environment. And sometimes it's not just the scan, but how you scan that is a good thing or a bad thing. So let's go through that. I'm going to use nmap FE to talk about what scans and what things are good and bad to do. I mentioned the default scan usually not going to cause a problem for you. And the default scan is one called the Send Stealth scan. That one works pretty well because it never actually opens up a particular session on a machine. There are other scans that do open sessions like the Connect scan. Now all these things are documented in the nmap documentation. But even Connect scans, connecting with TCP is just completing the three-way handshake. That in itself is not a horribly bad thing to do. And on the most part, a lot of these scans that are here are very innocuous when you run them. Now, if you're trying to be stealthy, that's a completely different issue. Things like a ping sweep, for instance, send a lot of ICMP frames if you're pinging a remote network. And if you're trying to be quiet on the network and somebody's looking at a trace file, you're going to see a bunch of ICMPs come through. But even those aren't necessarily bad on your network. When you start seeing things that really create problems is when you start tweaking the scans to create and look at other things. We mentioned the timing, and being normal throttling is a certain level of timing that is used. I have a table that's out on my website. I'll put this in those resource notes for tonight that talks about what the throttling does and how quick and how slow it can be if you go to insane throttling, what that really means from a timeout perspective. Because you can really slam a machine and cause it to, oh, wait a second, it holds up a little bit and creates a problem. I sort of even created a denial of service problem on my own machine just running the version detection earlier. But version detection is another good one because it goes in and pulls up a session and starts gets to the login screen. It doesn't log in, but it goes to the login screen to do some of those things. When you really start getting into situations where you're creating a denial of service, though, is when you start doing other things, and I'm looking for right here, where you start spoofing different devices. Let's say that I wanted to pretend that I was from 10.1.1.1 on this particular scan, and it does an IP spoof. When you start creating decoys on your network and creating spoofs, what you may be causing is an unopened or unclosed session to a device, because there will be responses that go back to 10.1.1.1, and that station's going to wait for a reply, except 10.1.1 doesn't really exist out there. I've got a nice graphic on my website that shows this happening as well. And you want to be really careful when you're doing decoys or you're spoofing an IP. Sometimes it's useful to use an IP that's already on your network and alive as the spoofed address. Sometimes it's preferable to do it that way. So anytime you do any type of spoofing with an IP address or you use decoys, be very careful about what you're doing, because it does have an effect on that other machine. So that hopefully is a very quick overview of what to watch for, and maybe not necessarily best practices, but it gives you a pretty good idea. But that was a very good question, Joshua. Thank you. We've got enough time for another couple of questions. So I'm going to flip through these questions. Some of them are talking about, there was a question about courses that are coming up. I talked about Vancouver, so for the Canadians, because I'd love to go up to Canada. But this question from Tim, he asked if there were any coming up in the States. And not that I know of, not in person anyway. You know, we've got the training course online, but I don't know of any right now that are going to be in the States that are going to be nmap only. And it's a good one to bring up to Fyodor. So I've made a note here and going to make him aware that there are some people asking about those things that might be useful as well. If you're not on our mailing list, which is out at nmapsecrets.com, go to the bottom of the page, get on the mailing list. I'm going to send you nmap tips and tricks every week. And if anything does come along, like a training course or something you might want to know about, I'll send that out as well. And I don't give away your IP address. This is something just for Professor Messer. I don't sell these things. I'm very particular about that kind of thing. And at any time, there's a remove me from the list button at the bottom. You can always do that, because that drives me crazy when you get on a list and there's no easy way to get off of that. You can do it all from that web front end. Very, very easy. Okay, let's take another 2 questions, and then we may have to finish it up tonight. So, a very good question that came in. This person's name wasn't here, but they were asking about Windows version of nmap, and the question's pretty good, because it says, is the nmap version of it, is the Windows version of nmap still pretty broke and deficient compared to the Unix version? And you know what? That's a good question, because in the past, Windows has been quite a challenge. Fyodor, as I described it, and he agreed it was a pretty good representation, he tolerates Windows. He works in Windows in spite of itself. And quite honestly, there have been a lot of really good developers in the nmap team that have done a good job at working with Windows through the years. Even when it seemed like Microsoft was creating patches and working against us, they still managed to find a way to do this. Today, in nmap version 4.20, the current version, it's a pretty darn good Windows program. It works very nicely. You still need the WinPcap library, but some of the things that were challenges in the past are gone. I mentioned earlier in the conversation there used to be a ton of Windows commands. You don't need them anymore. It works very nicely. And I often will use it in a Windows environment when I don't have my sandbox open, just to see what it will do, because I want to put it through its paces as well. So if you have not tried the Windows version in a while, and you're somebody who has a Windows desktop at work, because a lot of organizations still do, if you're like me, you sort of have the Windows box here and you have the Linux box right here, you could still run nmap on the Windows device. There are some advantages and disadvantages. We have a separate website. I put the text of my first edition of the book out on another website I have called Network Uptime. So if you've ever gone to networkuptime.com/nmap, and that's another one I need to put on the resource page, it's not there, but that's networkuptime/nmap. The entire text of my book, my first edition of the book, which is about a year old, so it still has some of those old Windows commands, but it does talk about Windows a little bit, and it does describe what some of those challenges are relating to the packets going back and forth and what it does. So, some comments there. Try it. You're going to like it. I think the newest version is pretty darn good. I'm really liking what they did with it. So, thank you for that question. Okay, one last question. Let's go. Think we talked about the replay. There's no way I'm going to be able to go through all these questions tonight, but I'll make sure I get some of these out on the website so you can see. One of the questions, okay, this is a good one to end on, because this is more of a philosophical discussion than it is a technical question, which is we're scanning a network. In some cases, we're scanning a network and people don't know we're there scanning the network. Is this an okay thing to do? Is this ethical? Is it reasonable to think that we're doing something wrong? Is it a situation where this is a bad? Could we be considered somebody doing evil things on the network if we're out there doing nmap scans? And as Fyodor put in his documentation, is that he has done thousands and thousands and thousands of scans on networks, and it's never been a problem. I think ultimately, when you start scanning someone's network, it's the difference in trying to see if the door is unlocked and the difference of walking into the house, grabbing the television, walking out with it. Your intention is very different, and what you do is very different. Knowing that there's a window unlocked, seeing a window from across the street and seeing that it's open is something entirely different than actually crawling through the window and creating problems for someone. nmap has an incredible potential to create safe environments. It is a fabulous tool to help protect your networks, because you're going to find the problems before the bad guys do. But just keep in mind, it is something that people could use to do bad things as well, because once you find that open device, now they're going to use other tools to go into the door and to get the television and take it out with them, because nmap doesn't do that particular level. But even then, some of the tools that are out there that do pen testing, penetration testing, are extremely valuable as well. Just because it's a security tool doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's all in how you use it, isn't it? So with that, I think we've come to the end of our presentation. I've got a couple of slides here at the end just to follow up with you. So there's your resource page again. Make sure you take advantage of that. I will update it tonight. I'll have in your inbox information about the replay. You can always send us comments at professormesser.com/contact_us. And very important, before you go, there's a survey that's going to pop up at the end of this. And I wrote this survey, so this is not something that's just automated that happens to pop up. I really want to know the information that I'm asking. There's just a couple of questions. I would really appreciate it if you took the time to answer a few of them. It would really help for the next webinar that we do. It'd be very, very useful for us. And I think as we start going through this and we start looking at these different ways to understand what we can do in a webinar for you, what you liked, what you didn't like, that's going to be useful as well. So as we go through the next webinar, we're going to use your input. We appreciate you coming here tonight. Thank you for joining us on this webinar and we hope to do many, many more of those. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone.